Hey guys, Sly here, and welcome back to another episode of the Caspian Game Awards. So, we are actually going to be covering the year 1995. But before we get into that, I do actually want to make a few things worthy of note. So, first of all, if it does sound like I am a bit stuffy, it's because, well, I am still kind of sick right now. Thankfully, I think I am good enough for me to be able to actually talk normally, so don't worry. We're still going to be able to do this tonight, but do keep in mind that, I am a bit stuffed up right now as far as my nose, but thankfully I don't have, a sore throat right now. I'm not coughing, so I should hopefully be good for the rest of the night. So, I hope you guys are pretty excited about that. But also, I've got actually a pretty special announcement, that... Actually, I'm actually going to announce it now, because... I think it's actually pretty important. So, I think I've mentioned this plenty of times, where I've been kind of flip-flopping about whether or not I wanted to cover the rest of the 90s, because, well, truth be told, this was originally going to be the final episode, I guess technically, of us doing this series. And it's been a long journey, trust me when I say this. I've been... Actually, I think I've actually been pretty happy about the fact that I've been doing this for almost an entire year now, where we've just been covering every single year of the past, almost 30 years now, as far as gaming history, and just having our own personal Game Awards ceremony for them. And just being able to not only talk about a lot of games that otherwise I probably wouldn't have been able to talk about to you guys, but also be able to discover a lot of newer games for me throughout this, these past 3 decades or so. It's honestly been one of the best experiences that I personally have had in just a while, and it's definitely kind of helped me gain a bit of appreciation for a lot of video games, not just of the past, but even in recent years. And so I lay that out there to tell you that I did a poll on Discord recently where I asked all of you guys if you wanted to see more episodes of this where I cover the rest of the 90s. Well, by popular demand, for the next 5 weeks, I will, in fact, be doing the rest of the 1990s, from 1994 all the way to the beginning of the decade in 1990. Granted, it's going to be very difficult because, again, the research has been snowballing a bit because, well, truth be told, Wikipedia's list of video games released in these years is definitely not complete. I don't know why, and it's going to be a bit annoying because of that. But suffice to say, we're going to be continuing the series, and I'm pretty excited about that. Though, you guys are probably wondering, well, why are you continuing this series, though? Because this is already way before your time. Well, yes, but that doesn't necessarily mean I can't cover stuff from before my time. Especially since I pretty much have been someone who grew up with a lot of stuff from this time period anyways. Because yes, I am a 2000s kid, but a lot of the stuff that I grew up with, whether it be movies, music, television, they came from the 90s. And I don't see video games being that different from any of that stuff. So, yeah, I don't know. I'm just pretty excited to talk about the rest of the 90s. Especially since, well, again, there's going to be some games that I probably would have otherwise not talked about. So, I'm pretty excited about that. Now, that being said, that brings us to the topic of tonight, 1995. Which, we've been on a pretty good streak. I'd say, 97, or 99, 98, 97, 96, those were pretty good years as far as video games are concerned. Some were better than others, but for the most part, the late 90s, fantastic era for video games. People really do underestimate how damn good of an era that was. So, is that streak continuing a little bit here? Well, no, unfortunately. Yeah, I gotta be real with you guys. Because at first, I thought 96 was going to be the year that was going to end that streak, because I thought, like, the late 90s, fantastic. And even going into 96, like, at first, I had a bit of trouble trying to figure out stuff, but I ended up finding a lot of, not only just a lot of really good hidden gems, but even a lot of games that I kind of forgot came out in 96. Unfortunately, I did not have that same experience with 95. And truth be told, I have a feeling that this is kind of where we're gonna start seeing kind of the crappier years for video games reap their ugly heads a little bit again. So, I mean, to be fair though, 95 was not a bad year as far as video games are concerned. Trust me, we've definitely talked about worse years before, but it was just kind of a mid-year. Like, for certain categories, it was a fantastic year. If you were a role-playing game fan or a platformer game fan, oh my god, 95 was an amazing year for you. But for everyone else, not so much. So, I hope you guys are ready for this one. So, and well, I'm not gonna really repeat what the series is. I'm pretty sure you guys know what the series is by now. So, but yeah, let's go over the let's refresh ourselves with the rules though. Especially considering that, well, for those who might be new, yes, we are doing our own Game Awards show for every single year in gaming history, all the way up to 1990. And well, these are the general rules that we have. So the first rule, as always, nominees. It has to be a game released that year. We are not doing weird cut updates, and we're not the stupid Grammys.
Don't yell at me, yell at the Grammys.
We don't do weird cut updates. We do the entire year. So anything released between January and December of that year counts. So also only 4 to 6 games per category, so that we have a balanced enough opportunity for games to win. And we count the initial release, not just North American releases. So if a game released in 96 or 97 in the US or Europe, we're counting the 95 Japanese releases here. So that's why some games that you guys might think came out in 96, they'll be here. As far as game of the year, generally they have to be like generally liked games, though I'm not gonna lie, 95 was kind of an awkward year for me, because keep in mind, IGN, this is the first year that websites like IGN didn't even exist, and Metacritic didn't even exist either. And so I'm really relying on a lot of reviews that either came out after the fact or reviews from completely different sources from this point onwards. It's going to be more difficult to try to figure out general consensus. And so from this point onwards, that part of the bullet point isn't going to be as prevalent. Though keep in mind, I'm still going to try to generally gather how people personally feel. Obviously with my personal opinion thrown in, but we'll get to that in a second. And, well, you see it, of course, right there. Has to be a completely new game. Not necessarily a bullet point that is needed anymore. As a matter of fact, this is probably going to be the last year I'll have this bullet point. So, do keep that in mind. And, well, like I said, these are only going to be games that I personally have been interested in, or I at least think look or play cool. Those will be nominated here. Because, well, we're biased here, but I'd rather be honest about my biases than just kind of lie to you guys and not acknowledge certain games. Because I like being transparent and honest. But in any event, let's begin by showing the categories for tonight. Which, unfortunately, not only could I not find enough games for the best game by a new studio, because, well, I'm going to be real with you guys, I just couldn't find enough. that, and also the fact that a lot of the studios that a lot of these debut franchises that I thought were made by new studios, turns out they've been made by studios that have been around for a long while. But also, you guys see, we had to remove a category. And it is sad for me to say that this is the first year that we will not be having a best expansion category. So I know that's disappointing, but this is around the time when expansion packs were still very new at the time. And I will be giving shoutouts to a few expansions at the end of the stream. But keep in mind that extra content for games was a new concept in the mid-90s. And, well, was only really exclusive to DOS and Mac releases of games, mostly DOS games. And yes, I did say DOS because Windows 95, of course, came out this year, hence the name. And there weren't really a lot of Windows games before 1995. So, yeah, we're in the DOS era deeply as far as the PC releases. And, well, we're in the Super Nintendo era now. So, expect a lot of Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis games on here. With still some PlayStation 1 and Sega Saturn games. But, well, that kind of goes into what I was saying about 95 being kind of a mid-year. Because if you guys have noticed a pattern with the series, is that for the most part, every single year that's been a transitionary year between console generations, it's been kind of a rough year. We saw that with 2000, we saw that with 2006, we saw that with 2020. The only year so far that has been an exception to that rule has been 2013. Every other, unless if you count 2012 with the Wii U release, which in that case, then yeah, definitely. But every other time that we've seen a definitive year be a transitionary year between console generations, it's been kind of rough. So, strap in, folks, because this one's going to be a bit this is going to be a bit of a bumpier ride. So, and yeah, this shouldn't actually be that long of a stream since we don't have as many categories this time. So, that's pretty exciting. But yeah, let's, I guess we shall begin. So let's start with the action-adventure category, which this is going to be a category that is going to be a bit iffy from now on. And truth be told, 95 was just not a good year as far as trying to find pure action-adventure games. As a matter of fact, there's not a there's only one game that's on here that's going to be a straight up action game that's going to be nominated. Because every other game on here is actually a point and click adventure game. Because this is the era in which that was kind of the trend. But that's not a bad thing. As a matter of fact, some of the games on here that I will be talking about are highly revered games in the respective point and click genre. But do expect this to just kind of be a low-key side. So, but although that being said, yes, point and clicks may not be all action-packed, but surprisingly enough, 1995 was actually a very big year for horror games, of all things. Which, kind of doing the research, kind of surprised me. But lo and behold, 95 was definitely the year of the point-and-click survival horror game. And that's exactly what I ended up choosing for this particular category. So, let's start with Alone in the Dark 3. So this is, of course, the third game in the Alone in the Dark series. And, it follows our little duo of, ghost hunters as they go to an abandoned town in the American Southwest. Keep in mind, this is definitely very different tone-wise compared to the previous two games, excuse me. And I'm pretty sure this was a bit more faster pace, compared to the first two games. But I will admit, it is still kind of similar to the first two games in a lot of ways. Because, again, Alone in the Dark, obviously a pioneer as far as survival horror games are concerned, without a doubt. And so, because of that, it's kind of hard to really look at these games through the lens of them being scary nowadays. Because, this is a game from 30 years ago. And I will admit, this game didn't really reinvent the wheel for the series quite as much as you would think. But the theming, I think, is pretty cool. And just the general atmosphere, I think, is pretty alright. So I'm willing to give it a pass. Especially since this was around the era when Alone in the Dark was definitely at its peak. And I don't think anyone's going to deny that. So, there's that. And then we've got ourselves the only action game on this action-adventure category. God, this is so stupid. But yeah, Crusader No Remorse. I'm not gonna lie, I was kind of debating on whether or not I wanted to have this in this category, if I want to have it in a different one, because the sequel, we loosely talked about in the last episode, it was kind of one of the earliest examples of third-person shooting action. But this game is a lot more general action-based, if that makes sense. And I think this game is definitely carried by its cool-looking, science fiction-y sort of, 90s sci-fi look, which is a style that, admittedly, I kind of have grown an appreciation for. Just that sort of that 90s, 2000s science fiction look that just, you can tell it's definitely a bit more just kind of rustic looking. I call it junker punk. I don't actually know what the term is. That's just a term that I personally coined for that style. And I don't know, I just think this game was kind of a cool looking top-down action game that, isometric top-down action game that at least did that a decent, gave it a decent amount of justification. So that's all I gotta really say about it. If you want to check, if that sounds interesting, go check it out. I thought it was actually alright. And then we got a game that I will admit is kind of a bit of a meme, but I actually am going to die on this hill that this is actually a pretty impressive and a pretty good game for what it is. The original Clock Tower. For the Super Nintendo, by the way. Yes. So this is our first Super Nintendo game for tonight. And funny enough, this game didn't actually have a North American release, or an official one, until recently. But that's a story for another day. This game, honestly, I feel like people really do underestimate how important of a game Clock Tower was. Because it was one of the first survival horror games that was released on console that made a big impact in the region that it came out of. And I find that to be pretty impressive. I mean, yeah, it still kind of plays like a point-and-click adventure game, but for the style of game that it was trying to be, is actually a lot more impressive than you would think. And again, I know this game's kind of a bit of a meme because JonTron covered it, a few other YouTubers covered it, and they were kind of memeing on it. But make no mistake, I would actually make a genuine argument that this is actually a pretty good game for the console and time period that came out. So, laugh all you want, but I do give this game a lot of respect. Which, speaking of point-and-click horror games, we've got two more of them up here. We've got... So, okay, let's go with the first one. So, this is a game that's based off of the novel of the same name called I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream. It is also a point-and-click horror-adjacent game. It leans more towards in a science fiction-y direction, although there's definitely elements of horror in it. And it time travels to different time periods through different people's perspectives. Sounds familiar if you're from the GameCube era. And it's definitely carried by its sort of mystery elements that I think is actually pretty cool for a game like this. Again, you're talking to someone who actually does appreciate a lot of point and click games, and to have a game that is a bit more kind of a blending of different genres, I think that's pretty cool. And I don't know, this game just kind of gives me like creepy vibes. Like, it's more subtle horror, and I think I like that. Which, well, that then leads us to the last game here, Dark Seed 2. The Dark Seed games are fucked up. Like, anyone who knows the first game and the sequel knows exactly what I'm talking about, especially with the H.R. Geiger looking imagery that, oh, it's so creepy. It's so creepy. Oh, I mean, it's in a good way, by the way. Like, but I will admit, this game isn't as talked about compared to its original game, but it's still a sequel that I think is worth a mention, especially since this game kind of helped develop a lot of the trapping, or not trappings, but just a lot of the motifs of a lot of horror games that, funny enough, we see nowadays. Like, especially as far as like the visual designs of a lot of the creatures that come out. So yeah, like Darkseid 2, I'd argue is actually kind of an important game that not a lot of people talk about as much anymore. But that being said, enough with the talking. Let's get to the awards. And I mean, again, these are older franchises here, so I'm not expecting anyone to be exactly excited about what game I'm going to be choosing. But I think the game that I did end up choosing is probably the one that makes the most sense in my mind for this. So, but yeah, of course, let's talk about that. So, the award for the best action adventure game of 1995 goes to Clock Tower. I know what you guys are thinking. Yes, I know this game is kind of a bit of a meme, but I am telling you guys, this is actually a genuinely pretty good game for the Super Nintendo. Because, well, I'm gonna be real with you guys. Even back in the day, whenever I watched a lot of those Let's Players or even just a lot of those review channels talk about this game, yeah, they were kind of making fun of some of the goofier elements from the time, but I'm not gonna lie, the game itself is actually genuinely really creepy. It has such a foreboding atmosphere throughout the entire game. And I played it myself, as a matter of fact. Well, I played it on this little bad boy right here, and it actually controlled a lot better than I thought it was going to be. Because again, it's a sort of point-and-click survival horror game on console, which that's kind of a big deal. Because, well, point-and-click games kind of hit or miss. This is one of those that I think actually hit. And I think it's helped by the fact that this game actually brought in some mechanics that are actually pretty popular in a lot of horror games now. Specifically the panic meter mechanic. Because yes, this game's health bar is based off of a panic meter. Where the more and more you are around some of the monsters or around some of the more psychological stuff, the more your sanity lowers, and the more likely you're going to get a game over. That's a mechanic that is very common. It was very common in the 2010s horror scene. Remember Amnesia, people? You can thank Clock Tower for introducing that mechanic in gaming. And I think this game does also deserve a lot of respect because this was one of the first Japanese horror games to gain a decent amount of attention. And yes, it does kind of have a lot of the same tropes that a lot of Japanese horror games had. But this was the first game to really do it. A lot of the stuff that we see in stuff like Resident Evil, Silent Hill, hell, even a lot of the obscure stuff like Haunting Grounds, it started with Clock Tower. And I gotta give it respect as far as establishing and pioneering in the Japanese horror scene. And again, this was done on the Super Nintendo. Super Famicom in Japan, but like still, that is insane to me. Because again, this was on console. This was not a PC release. This was on console on 16-bit hardware. I don't know about you guys, but I think that is a testament to this game. And yes, again, I know this game, it does have its weird quirks, especially for being a game from the mid-90s. But I have to be like real with my gut here and tell you guys that this is actually a genuinely good game that I do recommend you guys check out, especially if you want to know the history of survival horror games. So go check it out if you guys can, whether it's like a fan translated version of the original game or the re-release that WayForward made. Go check it out. So yeah, like I'm telling you guys, it's a lot better than you think. So, but yeah, let's move on to a different category of action game, platformers. Everyone loves a good platformer, right? And well, the mid-90s was actually a thriving period for this genre. You could not escape the mid-90s, or really just a lot of 90s games in general, without every other game being a platformer. It was just a common thing back in the day, which is of course why I decided to make this a category halfway through our series to begin with. And truth be told, there's a lot of great choices from this era that I'm going to talk about to you guys. Granted, some of them are better than others, and well, there's some on here that are definitely memes. But trust me when I say this, all these games are pretty good and stood out for the time. So let's start off with Gex, which, spoiler alert, this was actually going to be one of my choices for the best game by a new studio, because I don't know if you guys know this, but this game was made by a little known studio we've played it, you may have heard some of the games that they made. Ever know about the Tomb Raider reboots? Yes. The original Gex, and I'm pretty sure the sequels as well. Yes, the sequels. They were made by Crystal Dynamics. And I'm not gonna lie, and this is probably going to be the only time you're going to hear this coming from me. This is actually the only really damn good game from the 3DO. I said it. Live, on stream, I admit there's actually a good game on the 3DO. Caught on live, like... Okay, I'm joking, but like, I will admit though about Gex is it's more carried by its art direction than it is its gameplay, because I'm not gonna lie, it's just kind of an average 2D platformer, though it has some unique mechanics. Granted, some of those mechanics were taken from other games, but the fact that you can actually climb on walls and sort of traverse the level in a more linear fashion was what this made this game at least stand out compared to a lot of the competition that was out at the time. And again, I know Gex is a bit of a meme nowadays. He's seen as like a failed mascot, but truth be told, I will defend Gex as being actually a pretty good mascot platformer series that honestly, I wouldn't be too against them bringing back. Just update him a little bit, bring him out of the 90s, and it could still work. So, that's all I'm going to say about him. So let's move on to another mascot platformer, which, I mean, all these are mascot platformers, by the way. It should be pretty obvious. Because, you know, that was just kind of the era that we're talking about, and it was very, very prominent, and I'm just going to be frank right now, these were definitely the best choices. There were plenty of bad mascot platformers, but this is a pretty good selection regardless. Let's talk about Rayman. So the original Rayman was, at least in North America, was actually a launch title for the PlayStation 1. But little do people know, he did not actually start. The original game did not actually first release on the PlayStation 1. He was actually a release for the Atari Jaguar, of all things. Which is like, what? So, yeah, it came out, I think, in like April of 95 on the Jaguar, and then it came out in September on the PlayStation 1. Although more people know him for the PlayStation 1 version. And I'm not gonna lie, at least for me personally, the PlayStation 1 version is definitely the superior version to play him on. And yeah, no, the original Rayman, while yes, it can be fucking hard at points, the game still offers a lot of, you know, genuine charm with its sort of unique, cartoony, like whimsical world that you go through. And also the fact that this was one of the first platformers to really hone in on the combat aspect of the gameplay, because not a lot of platformers really did that. Well, except for the last one we'll talk about in a second. And I think that's actually pretty cool. It allows for a lot more offensive options for you to dispatch of enemies, as opposed to limited your limited like compared to a lot of the limited options in a lot of other platformers, where you either have to just straight up avoid enemies, or you can only just kind of take them out in specific ways. Rayman allowed for a lot more freedom of choice in that regard, and that's something that I gotta give credit to. So, yeah. Next up, we've got ourselves the sequel to Donkey Kong Country. Got Donkey Kong Country 2, which is the game. This is the game that follows Diddy Kong. So, I mean, it didn't really change too much compared to the first game, funny enough. Like, I wouldn't really say this is too much of a departure from the first Donkey Kong Country. But I think I mostly chose this more so on the backs of, this is just still a good, solid platformer for the Super Nintendo. And I think that is notable and respectable in a lot of ways. I mean, if I'm going to be honest, it's not really much else I gotta say. It's just a good, decent platformer. So, if you want more of like that style of platformer with Donkey Kong, you're gonna most likely like this one. And then we got Yoshi's Island, which, yes, as you can see, it was also dubbed as Super Mario World 2. Which, that's not entirely accurate. It's more like, it has some similarities. I mean, you're playing, you know, as Baby Mario with Yoshi, and that sort of mounting mechanic is present, but it's definitely not the major core of the gameplay. As a matter of fact, you're mostly playing Yoshi in this game, as opposed to playing as Baby Mario. And so that's not entirely an accurate name, but it's definitely, you can at least see where they're coming from. And it's still a game that is a quality game. And admittedly, it does actually have some, you know, pretty good and memorable sections, especially when you're on some of the like when you're in some of the mountainy platforming sections. I thought those were actually pretty cool. And I don't know, this is kind of a cool little side game in the Super Mario series. And yes, I do consider this to be a side game, not a mainline entry. So yeah, if you wanted just kind of if you wanted to play more Super Mario World but just exclusively Yoshi gameplay, you might actually like this game. And then we got Mega Man X3, which, I mean, there's not really, it's similar to Donkey Kong Country 2. There's really not much for me to really say about this game other than if you like Mega Man X1 or X2, you're gonna like X3. Very similar gameplay. Some loose changes here and there, like, you know, power-ups are done a little bit faster and stuff like that. But for the most part, it's not really reinventing the wheel. So, do keep that in mind. And then the last but not least, we got ourselves a game that I will admit is pretty dumb in concept, but I'm not gonna lie, it is a game that I still enjoy nonetheless. Maui Mallard in Cold Shadow. Which, yes, that is a dumb name. And it's a very dumb concept. Basically, and yes, by the way, this is a Disney game, if you can't tell. Basically, Donald Duck has an alternate persona called Maui Mallard where he's like a ninja fighter and he goes up against dark evil forces. It's stupid, it's dumb, but like, it's actually pretty fun. That's the funny thing. Like, I mean, keep in mind, this came out in 96 in North America, but it came out in 95 in Europe on the Genesis. So I guess that's kind of mostly what I'm basing this off of. And for a Genesis game, a late Genesis era game, because keep in mind, the Sega Saturn was already out by this point, it's actually a lot more enjoyable than you would think. And I'm even going to be honest, the Super Nintendo version is actually pretty good as well. So if you wanted a more, like, if you wanted something that was a bit more combat heavy as well, Maui Mallard's it's actually not a bad choice. I know, I can't believe I'm saying this. I can't believe I'm, like, you know, we're in the year 2024 and I'm saying Maui Mallard in Cold Shadow is a genuinely good game that if you like platformers, you can try out. That is a very, very, very dumb concept for me to say, but I gotta be real with you guys. Sorry. I gotta be real. It's actually pretty decent. But let's go over the winner. Because we got ourselves some pretty good choices regardless of how you guys feel. But unfortunately, there can only be one winner. So let's go over that. So, the award for the best platformer of 1995 goes to Rayman. This might be a bit of a controversial pick because I know some people are kind of iffy with Rayman, or at least the original game. But I do ultimately think this is probably the best choice that we've got here. I mean, first of all, this game is beautiful. Like, they really did take advantage of 5th gen hardware with this game. Again, originally being an Atari Jaguar release, and then ported over to the PlayStation 1. While yes, it didn't use 3D graphics, it didn't need to. It just used all that extra space that was put on these newer game consoles, and just ultimately ran with it. And it, like, that presentation really does make the experience a lot more visually vibrant and memorable in a lot of ways. And considering that this game has slower paced platforming but is more combat heavy, I think it helps making this a bit more accessible for newer players to begin with, especially since this was one of the platformers that actually got rid of the timer. So it allowed for a lot more freedom of movement and a lot more freedom of player choice, which is something that I'm a heavy advocate for. Now, that being said, this game is known for being hard as balls, especially in the latter half of the game. I get it. It is not an easy game, and it will piss you off. Trust me, this game will piss you off. But even just kind of like, despite that, I still genuinely think that this game has a lot more pros than cons going for it. And it is definitely a game that I can respect as like a piece of gaming history. So I think Rayman is, at least in my opinion, the best choice for 1995 for best platformer. But now let's get into the other pretty big category of this year. Role-playing games, RPGs. 1995 was Square's, arguably one of their biggest years. Because, oh my god, they had so many games released in 95. It's not even funny. And hell, there were plenty of RPGs that I had to snub for honorable mentions. That's how damn good of a year 1995 was for role-playing games. This was a fantastic year for role-playing games. Especially if you were a JRPG fan. But unfortunately, for some people, I ultimately could choose up to 6 choices here. I just can't have more than that because I don't want to bloat the list too much. But what did I end up choosing? Well, frankly, the screen speaks for itself. Granted, some of these were originally not released in North America. Some of these were released in Japan first, and didn't get ported over here until much later. Or in some cases, like Terranigma, that didn't release here, or it didn't release here at all. It only released in Europe and Japan, but I still got my hands on it, and I still want to talk about it. But let's start off with already a pretty big name as far as JRPGs are concerned. Chrono Trigger. I don't think I need to explain this one for you guys, because Chrono Trigger is highly regarded as being one of the best JRPGs of all time, hands down. And there's a good reason for that, because of its amazing art direction, its more streamlined combat compared to a lot of other JRPGs at the time, and just the general tone being a lot more noble compared to even something like your Final Fantasies. It makes for a pretty memorable experience that, yeah, I could definitely see the appeal for. And yeah, no, this game is actually pretty damn good. It really does make me upset that Chrono Trigger was not a base game for the Super Nintendo Classic. It is actually a crime that they didn't do that. But, well, I can play it because I got it, but whatever. But yeah, go check out Chrono Trigger if you guys haven't already. But that's not the only game that was pretty big as far as the JRPG scene is concerned. Because, truth be told, Dragon Quest VI is also a game that is worth of a lot of praise. Basically, this was, I think, the only Enix game that's on here. I think. I can't actually tell, but whatever. But yeah, Dragon Quest VI. Basically, not a massive overhaul compared to Dragon Quest V, because that was an overhaul compared to the first 4 games. This was just kind of more of a continuation of the themes that they had with that game. And I think it works. This game has pretty snappy combat. It has, again, also a pretty beautiful world. Obviously, all of these games have beautiful pixel sprite art direction, which, of course, to be expected for the Super Nintendo, at least for me personally. But yeah, no, this game is definitely more definitely more carried by just being a solid continuative sequel to Dragon Quest V, if that makes sense. So, that's all I gotta really say. And then we got Terranigma, which is actually technically a sequel. Yes, this is actually not the first game in this thing. It's actually part of a trilogy, a loose trilogy of games that I coined as the Gaia trilogy, since the first game is called The Illusion of Gaia. This is the last game in that sort of trilogy. And I will admit, this is probably the weakest out of the 3 games, but it's still a game that I would still highly recommend you guys seek out for yourselves. Of course, a lot more high fantasy oriented. Actually, a lot of JRPGs were at the time. And just kind of being a lot more narrative driven compared to even a lot of some of the other RPGs at the time. So yeah, go check it out if you haven't. If that, I don't know. Admitted, I'm not gonna lie. A lot of these games are. You might think they might blend a lot together, but once you play them, you know that there's some differences. But I don't know. Just want to give it a bit of a shout out. And speaking of shout outs, Romancing Saga 3. This was the last of the Romancing trilogy at the time. Obviously, Saga as a series would continue on after this, but this was like the last game in that sort of story arc that we have going on here. A lot more of a sort of, divine versus demonic storyline going on, and just kind of that eternal struggle of, the powers that be being a big theme within the Saga games. So check it out. And then we got Lufia 2, Rise of the Sinistrals. Again, this one has some loose sci-fi elements to it. This is like the closest thing to a science fiction-y thing that we've got on here. Though, keep in mind, it is still a fantasy RPG at heart. But similar to many of the other games that are on here, just it's definitely carried by its sort of general narrative. So, I'm sorry. I'm sorry if it sounds like I don't know what I'm talking about. It's just these are definitely for like a very specific crowd. But I'm still nominating all these games because of the impacts that they had for their respective niches within the JRPG sort of scene, if that makes sense. This one being more on the action RPG side of things. So if that is something that interests you and you want a bit more of a sci-fi tinge to your JRPGs, Lufia 2 is probably the closest you can get on this list. Which then brings us to the last game, Secret of Evermore. Which I think this is probably the closest that we've got to competition with Chrono Trigger as far as, hype. At least from what I know of with this game. So this game has a bit more of a urban fantasy feel to it. But a lot of the same praises that a lot of people give to Chrono Trigger actually apply to Secret of Evermore as well. This game has some beautiful looking pixel art, and it's helped by the fact that this game is just, set in a kind of a unique premise at the time. It's, you're just kind of you're fighting a lot of giant, bug creatures throughout much of the game. And sort of that combining of real life elements in this fantastical setting, that was a new thing at the time. Not a lot of urban fantasy was a thing. I mean, keep in mind, this predates Harry Potter. So having that sort of bridge be built makes this game stand out. And truth be told, I played it myself. I think it's actually one of the best RPGs from that year for sure. So, if I'm going to be honest, it's really between Chrono Trigger, Dragon Quest VI, and Secret of Evermore. But make no mistake, all these games are fantastic in their own right. And I do highly recommend, if you guys are fans of JRPGs, go check out every single one of them that's on here. These are regarded as being some of the best JRPGs of all time. So, and again, I'm not even going into the game. We're not even talking about the RPGs that I had to snub. But ultimately, I have to choose one game. Though, keep in mind, one more thing before I actually move on. Every single one of these games was released on the Super Nintendo. Yes, these are not PC releases. These are not PlayStation 1 releases. These are not Sega Genesis releases. These are Super Famicom, Super Nintendo releases. Which really just goes to show that they went all out for the last major year for the Super Nintendo. And it shows. So let's go over the winner. It is admittedly pretty close because, again, Chrono Trigger and Secret Evermore are, original IPs that are highly regarded by a lot of people, and Dragon Quest VI is up there. But what's gonna win? Well, let's do it. So the award for the best role-playing game of 1995 goes to Chrono Trigger. I mean, this one is kind of one of those choices where it's like, I think most people are going to agree with. I don't think anyone is going to argue with me about Chrono Trigger. You can definitely make a good case for Secret of Evermore, but Chrono Trigger is just one of those games that is just highly regarded across the board. Especially with this game being just an overall refined JRPG that does a lot of small things that tweak the overall experience. So, I mean, of course, this game has an in-depth narrative, where you're with your, companions and you're going against the dark evil forces. Of course, very, very common sort of trope that, by this point, has been well established. But, definitely the dialogue that's written here, they took a lot of notes from Final Fantasy VI, of all things, and applied a lot of those same lessons to this game. In that dynamic between your party members, and even going against a lot of the enemies that you go up against in this game, that's what ultimately makes this narrative more cohesive. And that's why this game is as cherished as it is. But even just besides that, this game streamlined a lot of the combat to where you could just pick up and play without having to do too much, without worrying too much about a lot of the technical stuff that you have to do. Because the problem with a lot of older JRPGs is that they have a lot to do with different synergies, boostings, and debuffings of different damage types depending on your weapons and what types of magic they're using. This game kind of made it a lot more easier for people to understand without having to really rely on a guide. You play this game without looking at a guide and do it pretty well. That wasn't really a thing with a lot of JRPGs or just RPGs in general at the time. And I think that is something that I got to give a lot of credit to. And it's also helped by the fact that this game does have beautiful presentation. This game, again, has really good art direction. And, well, even though this game technically wasn't the first game to have New Game Plus, this was one of the first games that really made it worthwhile because, well, as far as my knowledge is concerned, this was one of the first games that had a New Game Plus where you kept some of the items in your previous save for you to be able to use in your new playthrough. Which, again, very new at the time. Because typically what happens is once you're done with the game, you're done. Just replay the game over again. You don't carry a lot of the progress from before. This was one of the first games to actually do that. And it incentivized for more replays. And ultimately, I think those are ultimately the reasons why this game is as highly revered as it is. So if you guys haven't already, go check out Chrono Trigger. There's no reason for you not to, especially since this game has had plenty of different releases on multiple consoles. So, do it. Do it. Alright. Shooter games. I'm not gonna lie. This was kind of an iffy year for shooter games. I mean, first-person shooters were still new, so of course we're not going to have too many of those. So we're going to be having a lot more shoot-'em-ups and rail shooters from this point onwards. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we got some duds this year. As a matter of fact, we got plenty of games that were actually pretty good in all these different subgenres of shooter games. But let's start off with something a bit basic. Let's start off with Star Wars Dark Forces, a Doom clone for Star Wars, a game that we played back in 2022, 2 years ago, and I thoroughly enjoyed. I thought it was actually pretty good, sort of game that helped sort of expand on some of the ideas of the Death Star's secret plans, as well as just kind of bridging a lot of the gaps in between the conflicts between episode 4 and 5. I thought that was actually pretty good. And also for being one of the first Doom clones that had a bit of a narrative to it, which was groundbreaking at the time. No other first-person shooter had a narrative, except this game. Pretty big deal if you ask me. So, I felt like I had to choose this. So, of course. But then we've got ourselves Panzer Dragoon, which we actually talked about its sequel in the last episode, slight spoiler alert. But this was a new IP that Sega had for the Sega Saturn at the time. It was a fantasy rail shooter that was kind of their response to Star Fox. And, I mean, yeah, the game obviously looks dated now, but keep in mind, 3D graphics were still new. And I think this game actually looks pretty, not only looked pretty cool, but also played a lot better than you would think. It's a lot more engaged with its combat compared to a lot of other rail shooters, especially since, well, this was one of the first fully 3D rail shooters. And I don't know, this game was just kind of cool to mess around with, especially since I'm a bit of a fantasy junkie, and having a rail shooter that was essentially just Star Fox, but in a fantasy setting, I thought was pretty cool. Definitely one of the few Sega Saturn IPs that has basically stood the test of time, at least in my opinion. So, granted, do not play the remake. The remake sucks. Just try to find like either a Sega Saturn and play this, or try to emulate it. Or if there's like a re-release of this, of the original version, just do that. And then we got Hexen, another Doom clone. But this one actually is one that is also pretty unique in a lot of ways, because this is not a traditional Doom clone. Yes, it is actually in the same exact engine that Doom used, so id Tech. Yeah, it's on the id Tech 1 engine. But what made this game stand out was the fact that this was one of the first games that had class-based combat. As in, you chose like the class you wanted to be, warrior, cleric, and archer, I believe, were the classes. I don't remember exactly, but basically you had like a melee guy, a ranged guy, and then like a wizard guy. And they all had completely unique weapons. They did not share a single weapon between each other. You had 4 weapons per class, so 12 weapons in the game. And yeah, you basically just went to town against a bunch of fantasy monsters like centaurs and ogres and ettins, 2-headed ogres. And yeah, no, this game is actually pretty cool in that respect. And that's not even the most unique part about this game. The most unique part is its branching levels, which was a new thing for Doom clones. Because after you defeat a level, you actually go to a hub area, which was a new thing for shooter games, just in general. That's a pretty big deal, if you ask me. And, well, just, I mean, again, another fantasy shooter game. I'm going to be biased because I love fantasy. So, because of that, yeah, no, Hexen, Beyond Heretic, I think it's pretty cool. And yes, by the way, this is actually a indirect sequel to Heretic from the year prior. So, that's why it says Beyond Heretic. Because it's involving the 4 Horsemen of the Apocalypse. And you're going after the second one here. And then we got ourselves Alien Soldier, which was a shoot 'em up from, like, for the Sega Genesis. Again, kind of a late Sega Genesis release. I mean, this is basically just Anthro, AV, and Contra. So, I mean, I know that sounds dumb, but it's actually a lot more enjoyable than you would think. I mean, I like Contra, so that's obviously going to appeal to me. So if you just want a little bit more, Anthro in your Contra, here you go, I guess. And then we got Marathon 2 Durandal, which, again, I know I have been I feel like I've been kind of mixed about Marathon in recent years. But considering that this was a Mac release and not a DOS release, I gotta give it at least a little bit more leeway. And for being a Mac release, first-person shooter, Marathon 2, and just by extension the rest of the Marathon games, I think I was just a bit too harsh on. I think these games, they're more carried by just them having a lot of background lore, I feel like. Which is something that I think is actually pretty cool about them. And I don't know, just kind of being an early example of being able to, like, a good example of a game that was able to branch out away from DOS as far as shooters are concerned, first-person shooters are concerned. So I think ultimately that's kind of why I ultimately had to feel like I gotta give the nod to this. And then last but not least, I feel like I've been neglecting this franchise because there's been like 10 other games that have released since then, but this is the first time I'm finally acknowledging this. We got Time Crisis, which is a light gun rail shooter this time around. You guys are probably wondering, why didn't you talk about this series until now? Well, it's because there's your problem right there. A light gun shooter. You kind of need to have a peripheral for you to be able to play these games. And even then, you can't play them with modern TVs. You have to use CRTVs, because the way in which light guns worked from around this time is that they relied on the curvature sensors that were on the curved TVs of like the big box TVs. And unfortunately, it makes it to where if you try to use a flat screen, it just won't register. So, like, though to be fair, to be fair to this series, I think there has been different ports, and hell, this actually first released in arcades. This wasn't a PlayStation release. This was actually released in arcades first. And I remember playing, I think it was Time Crisis 4 on arcade. So like I have experience with the series. And truth be told, for a game that is essentially a rail shooter that is time-based, because the whole point, it's in the name, Time Crisis. You basically have to do like all the levels in a certain amount of time before you are able to move on to the next stage. And it's definitely like a concept that, yeah, it's definitely very arcadey. And well, this was an arcade machine. So like, for the time, it made sense. And I'll even just say this right now. Even nowadays, it's even a concept that I think people have kind of yearned for in recent years. Because I've been seeing a lot of remakes of a lot of these rail shooters. I mean, I already mentioned the Panzer Dragoon one earlier. There was the the House of the Dead one, which unfortunately also kind of sucked. Like, there is a market for this sort of thing. It's just there hasn't been a lot of good remakes. Yeah, there just haven't been that one that has stuck out in recent years. But as far as a rail shooter is concerned, for the unique gimmick that it had, I will give it props. So that's all I gotta really say. So yeah, let's go over the winner. Which I feel like this one's going to be another one that might be controversial, but at the end of the day, I'm just going with my gut here. So, the award for the best shooter game of 1995 goes to Star Wars Dark Forces. Admittedly, this one's a safe choice. Like, this one's probably the most safe choice that I could have on here. Because, it's Star Wars. Like, that's kind of a default choice. But there's a reason why I do think that this is actually a pretty good game, even just kind of besides that. And it's based off of the innovations that this game actually had, especially compared to other first-person shooters at the time. So, first of all, this game had a lot of different, like, varied locations. Because a lot of shooter games from the mid-90s, and hell, even a lot of games from the late 90s, they all just kind of looked, like, all the levels just kind of looked the same. I mean, maybe you'll get, like, a different shade of, like, gray, or a different shade of brown, or shade of green, or blue. But, like, that's about it. There wasn't really a lot of level variance in a lot of games from before then. The most you really got was just the difference between, the first chapter of Doom where you're on Mars, and then the second chapter where you're mostly indoors, and then the third chapter where you're on Hell itself. So, like, I guess that's a bit of variance. But Dark Forces took that, step, like, multiple steps ahead, where you had levels that were set in junkyards, in mountains, in snowy environments, in more ready desert areas, in cities, in cities and space stations. It was able to spice up the levels a lot more compared to a lot of the other Doom clones at the time, which I think is definitely not positive. But also, this was one of the first games, as far as first-person shooters, where you had an objective in each level. You weren't just going around collecting key cards. You were actually doing stuff in the maps themselves. Whether it was, trying to find a certain NPC, whether it was trying to gather intelligence, whether it was destroying a specific thing on the map. Like, this game had level design variance between each area, and that's something that, again, was very new at the time. And I gotta give credit where credit is due. And even beyond that, this was one of the first games that had a full-fledged narrative backed behind by its campaign. No other first-person shooter, other than maybe System Shock, had that. Where they actually had... Because most first-person shooters before Dark Forces, and hell, even after Dark Forces, the story was basically just either experiment goes wrong, or like some sort of like supernatural invasion. That's basically that's basically just kind of the extent of your stories for a lot of these games. Whether it was Doom, whether it was Marathon, whether it was Heretic Hexen, whether it was fucking hell, even like some of the stuff that came after this, like Duke Nukem or Quake, Wolfenstein, even Rise of the Triad. Like, they were just kind of static-y stories. But Star Wars Dark Forces, being a Star Wars game, decided to take it to the next level by tying in the story to the overarching plot. Having it to where, you know, the first mission, you're literally stealing a part of the Death Star plans. Which I know Rogue One funny line here and there. Although, if this were to be canon again, I would explain that this was only a part of it, and that was also only a part of it in Rogue One, but whatever. And also introducing, you know, some of the other cool concepts in the expanded universe, such as the Dark Troopers, which, I mean, those are pretty cool. And just adapting a lot of the elements that were in the movies and some of the expanded universe material in a pretty cohesive way that feels in universe. Hell, even the weapons in this game that were new, they feel like Star Wars weapons. So at the end of the day, I do consider this to be a pretty good first-person shooter for the time that I recommend you guys check out, especially since, well, this game indirectly did start the Jedi Knight series. So if you want to know about the beginnings of Kyle Katarn, this is the game to do it. Alright, Sim Strategy. This is another category that had a decent amount of games from it, and so this is a maxed out list. Though keep in mind that this is about as much as you could get from this year. So it was a decent year for the Sim Strategy category, but I wouldn't say it was like an amazing year. Well, amazing in some ways, but rather okay in others. So let's talk about that. First off, we got ourselves Jagged Alliance, a real-time tactics game that we've talked about some of the other games previously before. Being set in like an alternate Cold War scenario. And, I mean, it was basically just real-time XCOM. That was the main appeal of Jagged Alliance, is that it took a lot of the aspects that was popular with XCOM and just tweaked it to where it was able to be done in real time. And I think that was actually pretty cool of this game. It definitely made it stand out in a lot of ways. Well, as a result, and also because this was a bit more grounded in a realistic setting that made it to where it was a lot more relatable with the gameplay itself. I mean, it's definitely not the most realistic game ever. Trust me, it has its goofy moments. No, the sequels do as well. But this is definitely a game that was a step in the direction in which a lot of like games, at least tone-wise, were going with. And I think that's something that is worth noting, which, well, speaking of a more realistic tone, we've got Air Combat, which, yes, I know what I chose as far as the representation for the game, it says Ace Combat. Well, that's because this is actually the first game in the Ace Combat series. Yes. So, Ace Combat started with Air Combat, because it was, I think it was originally supposed to be loosely based off of like a movie from the 80s, but because of copyright issues, they had to change the names. Like they had to change the name of the series. And so that's why the sequel is called Ace Combat 2 and not Air Combat 2. But yeah, as far as being a flight sim for consoles, this was actually a pretty impressive game. There were just not that many flight sims or for like console at all, with a few exceptions, but well, they weren't particularly very good. This was one of the first games that actually was a good game that was able to do that, especially for a console that didn't even have analog at the time. Because people forget this was what the PlayStation 1 controller originally looked like. It was not a DualShock controller. It did not have analogs. The fact that they were able to make a flight sim work with a controller like this, I gotta give them a lot of respect. Namco, you guys did it. You somehow made a pretty good flight sim using these controls, and actually gave a pretty good draw distance for a console like the PlayStation 1. Like, oh my god. It's actually insane. So yeah, like Ace Combat, at least in my opinion, deserves recognition. But let's go back to the tactics side of strategy games. Speaking of XCOM, we got XCOM sequel, Terror from the Deep. Which, this one is a weird one. I know I keep saying which. I do apologize. I just don't know how to transition well. But XCOM Terror from the Deep, this is a different XCOM game, because this one is mostly set underwater. And you're fighting underwater aliens. Interesting concept. A weird one, but I mean, Doctor Who has had Earth creatures, or, Earth creatures before, so it's not like a unused trope before. Though it would have been cool if these were actually native Earth creatures, because they're not. They're aliens that landed on Earth during the invasion of the first game that just so happened to be aquatic based. But even besides that concept not being as how I personally would have wanted it, it's still a pretty engaging game. It is more or less the same gameplay as the original XCOM, but the original XCOM is already a fantastic game for its time. So I'm not even going to complain. This is a fantastic game. If a bit samey, just the underwater gimmick at least gives it a bit more of a variance difference, and I think it's worthy enough for being a sequel to an already fantastic game for when it came out. So yeah, go check it out if you guys haven't already. Which, speaking of checking out, got the original Command and Conquer, which, god damn it, I did it again, I'm sorry. Command and Conquer, the original. This game is pretty awesome. It wasn't the first real-time strategy game, but I definitely think that it was the first RTS that shook the scene a bit, if that makes sense. I mean, keep in mind, Warcraft 1 came out a year prior, which of course we'll get to the sequel in a second. And yes, that was definitely the game that put it into the mainstream. Command and Conquer not only put it in a more science fiction direction, like put the genre in a more science fiction direction, but it was also a game that took it in a more pseudo-contemporary setting and a more streamlined way. In a specific way. It's not streamlined in the way in which RTS games would eventually become, but having a lot smaller map design really did benefit this game. But I don't know. Well, that and also the presentation with the acting in this game made it a bit more cohesive compared to Warcraft. So I'm going to give it credit there. Which, of course, leads us to the last two games on here. We got the original Heroes of Might and Magic, and we got Warcraft 2, Tides of Darkness. Let's start out with Heroes of Might and Magic. So this game was basically pitched as Civilization, but fantasy. This is a spin-off of the Might and Magic series, which has been around since the late 80s. And this was a more 4X style of strategy game, where it was more turn-based. And yeah, I will admit it's definitely dated in a lot of ways, especially with a lot of the character designs, but it's mostly carried by its general sense of gameplay, since this was one of the first games to really have a lot of the gameplay mechanics that a lot of other strategy games nowadays has. Stuff like diplomacy, stuff like unit management, city management, and all that fun stuff. So if you want a 4X game that was more fantasy-based, Heroes of Might and Magic is not a bad choice. And then we got Warcraft 2, which, of course, is the sequel to the original Warcraft. This one, I mean, the cover is a bit misleading because, yeah, it does show that this has a bit more of a nautical feel. That's not entirely the case. It's just some of the units. As a matter of fact, a lot of the stuff that was in the first Warcraft, and they actually just carried a lot of that over here. It just has a different campaign. And plus, this game had, like, for the humans, they also have dwarf and elven units in this, where they didn't have that in the first game. And the orcs, I think, had some, like, Tauren and undead, if I'm not mistaken. It's been a while since I played this, if I'm going to be honest, but I recently bought it because of the thing with Blizzard recently, but that's a story for another day. But as far as a game, like a real-time strategy game, it's a decent successor to the original game. So that's all I gotta really say about it. Let's go over the winner. So the award for the best sim strategy game of 1995 goes to Command and Conquer. I think I need to really emphasize just how big of an impact this game had at the time for the real-time strategy genre. Because, well, truth be told, this was the direct response to Warcraft. And even compared to Warcraft, and I compare Warcraft 1 to this because this was their first direct competition, it was a lot more easier to control. Because the original Warcraft, and even Warcraft 2, the controls are just kind of all over the place. And even just trying to do a lot of resource management, it can be a bit tedious. But this game streamlined a lot of the controls to where it was more or less, you can just do stuff with just one button, and then you're good. Like hotkeys, essentially. You can just rely, and also you can do stuff more so with the mouse, as opposed to, well, only using your keyboard to do all the mechanics in the game. I think that makes for a lot more of a user-friendly experience. Also, I already mentioned earlier that this game had smaller maps, but it makes it to where it's a lot more engaging for players to actually go on and go around the different maps. And I think that helps a lot when it comes to managing your units and your resources, because of course this is a resource management based RTS where you have to gather a bunch of alien crystals that landed on Earth. So obviously you're going to want to make sure that you have a decent amount of units. But even just kind of besides that, this game has really damn good sound design and music. Oh my god, I love the music in this game. It's one of those soundtracks that I feel like people really undersell. It's so damn good. Yes, there's some goofy ones like CNC thing where it's the yeah, 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 yeah. Like that's such a 90s sounding track. But I mean, it is a catchy song, and there's other songs that are more serious that I think are pretty cool. And just the general sound design for this game is fantastic. Guns sound snappy, explosions are nice. Even your announcer sounds very like intimidating. It's honestly one of those games that I think people should check out. And considering that this game was recently released on Steam, and there's even the remaster, there's no reason for you not to. And of course, that's not even getting into the fleshed out campaigns that have, you play as either the GDI or the Brotherhood of Nod. And Kane, being the charismatic asshole that he is, really does steal the show here. I forgot the actor's name, but basically, yeah, the guy who plays him, he does a fantastic job as portraying Kane as like the leader of the Brotherhood of Nod. And even just a lot of the not voice acting, but actual acting in this game, you can tell that they were definitely passionate about this game. And that's something I can respect. So yeah, Command & Conquer, pretty good. Alright, sports, racing, fighting. A category that I've mentioned before is not really a category I really cared for to begin with. And we're starting to really see that here, because truth be told, we're starting to see less and less games that I really give a shit about. There's barely going to be anything on here. I'm just going to spoil it for you guys. Not to say that there wasn't anything interesting from 1995 as far as this category is concerned, but prepare to not see a lot here from this point onwards. So do keep that in mind. But what I ended up choosing, I think people are going to be fine with. So we've got 2 fighting games and 2 racing games. Of course, I've never been a sports game fan to begin with other than skateboarding games, so that's not even going to be in the question here. But let's start off with Battle Arena Toshinden, which was originally released on arcades before it was released on the PlayStation 1. And funny enough, the sequel came out literally within the same year, which is like, what? And this one is more of a melee-based combat fighting game, which you guys know is the type of, like, that's the style of fighting game that I've always preferred. And being a 3D, wait, no, was this 3D or, I don't remember. Shit, I don't remember. But I'm gonna double check, because I might be thinking of Virtua Fighter, now that I think about it. I'm gonna double check that right now, because I don't want to look like a fool. Okay, I was right. It was 3D. Okay. But yeah, for being one of the earliest 3D fighting games, I definitely think that it is a decent little experiment for what they were trying to do. Obviously, other games would come afterwards, but ultimately, I do think that this is a game that is an important step, especially for people like me who don't really like a lot of the fist-to-fist fighting games. So, I think that's worth something, which, of course, that gets us into Mortal Kombat 3. We're starting to get into the classic era of Mortal Kombat here. This being the 3rd game of that original trilogy. I'm pretty sure Mortal Kombat 3 No, the second one is the most popular. This is, I'd say this... Yeah, no, this one... Yeah, Mortal Kombat 2 is the more popular one. But Mortal Kombat 3 is still a highly regarded game in the Mortal Kombat franchise. It is definitely a game that was a lot more fine-tuned compared to even the previous games. And considering that there were multiple different versions that came out on multiple different consoles, that really did help. I mean, yeah, that was kind of the same thing with the first two games, but the quality of in between both the arcade release and the console versions, it was a lot closer this time around. And I mean, it's helped by the fact that this game was definitely the first Mortal Kombat that I think was released on a mass scale that, as it was. And because of that universal wide reach, I think that's ultimately why this game is as revered as it is. So, yeah, I gotta say this is a pretty decent little entry in the series. And then we've got the racing games. So Destruction Derby is a vehicular combat-based racing game. It was one of the first of its kind. And, well, it's kind of a precursor to the Burnout series, or at least that's kind of how I see it. So if you like that style of racing game, you might like Destruction Derby. You know, about, you know, just kind of taking out your like, you know, competitors through, you know, destroying their vehicles. I'm laughing because, you know, if this was in real life, that'd be terrifying. But I mean, that's Destruction Derby. That's all I gotta really say about it. It's just proto Burnout. So, also we've got Wipeout on here. All right, Wipeout. Technically, this one also is a vehicular combat-based racing game, but it's less destructive and more defensive, if that makes sense. It's more of a hybrid between... I like to see Wipeout as basically a hybrid between Super Mario Kart and F-Zero. It's more in the line of something like that, where it's definitely not realistic at all. It's more science fiction racing. But admittedly, that's actually kind of why it's cool and why it stands out, is that this was a 3D sci-fi racing game that was unique for the time, and truth be told, is still unique to this day. I can't think of any other game that's like it, other than, like I said, F-Zero, and even then, F-Zero kind of has its own thing going on with it. So, yeah. I think it's pretty obvious what I'm going to choose. Alright, whatever. Let's do it anyways. The award for best sports racing fighting game of 1995 goes to... It's Wipeout. It's Wipeout. Admittedly, I am a bit more apathetic about these choices because these aren't games that I'm particularly like close with. But I'm gonna choose Wipeout for this one, mostly because it is the most unique out of all these four. I mean, it has a futuristic racing aesthetic, kind of a cyberpunky look. I mean, just look at the cover. That should tell you everything about what this game is going to look like. And I think that helps in its favor, because a lot of racing games were more realistic looking at the time, or they were kart racers. So having a game that was more of a speed car based racer, I thought was pretty good. And, well, the fact that this game was an extremely fast racing game for its time, for 3D, that's impressive. And, well, like I said, this one, yes, it's technically vehicular combat, but it's not like, you destroying the enemies. It's more disadvantaging them is what is essentially is going on. Like, you have you have missile weapons that are essentially more or less like the power-ups from Super Mario Kart. And so just imagine having these high octane races while trying to dodge a bunch of enemy fire. It leads for a lot of intense gameplay. And I think that's what really makes this stand out. And, well, this was a PlayStation 1 release. So this was one of the first racing games that was fully 3D that was actually competent. Because, well, truth be told, some of the ones that came up before this that were on console weren't particularly that good. This was one of the first ones that was. So, I think that's worth something. But, yeah, anyways. Let's go to art direction. This category is gonna be a bit tough because this one, I think, well, especially now, because this one's gonna be strictly based off of if I like the setting or not from this point onwards. Because we're getting into the era of the pixel art, we're dealing with in-game sprites. There's a lot less room for artistic interpretation from this point. Which, I mean, you could definitely make that argument. You could definitely make the counter argument of okay, well, there's more limitation. That means more creative expression can be made. Yes, but there's only so much you can do from this era. I mean, keep in mind, this is the beginning of the PlayStation 1 era, or at least in North America. I mean, Japan already had the PlayStation 1 a month prior to the beginning of 95. And so it's going to be a bit slim trying to find the best game to represent this. That being said, these are the games I ended up choosing. I chose Chrono Trigger for its cool sort of, mixing of different styles of medieval and fantasy together. I chose Rayman for its cool, whimsical fairy tale look. Now, I always thought was pretty cool with Rayman. Clock Tower for its sort of dingy Japanese horror look, obviously set in the middle of in a mansion in the middle of the woods, being kind of a creepy atmosphere. Wipeout for its science fiction, cyberpunk racing aesthetic, and Hexen for its dark fantasy, Doom-like pixel art, which I thought was pretty cool. Very different aesthetics across the board. So obviously this leaves a lot of personal, opinion in here. Probably more so than any other time we've done this. But I think the game I ended up choosing, people are going to be fine with. So, the award for the best art direction of 1995 goes to Chrono Trigger. I mean, I'm a sucker for fantasy games, so of course I'm going to be a bit biased here. But even besides that bias, I do think this game has a pretty cool look. Obviously, it's pixel, so it's going to be a bit more interpretive. But from what I gathered, they took a lot of inspiration from a lot of medieval and medieval European and feudal Japanese architecture and just sort of combined the two, making it pretty unique for the time. Also combining a lot of the elements of different fantasy tropes with these more Middle Age designs from, Europe and Asia. It makes for a game that, at least for the time, wasn't really like a lot of other games, because a lot of other RPGs kind of stuck to one aesthetic. Like Final Fantasy, for example. In the first 5 Final Fantasy games, those are just straight up medieval fantasy games. Not really much else like beyond that. Final Fantasy VI, of course, changed things up a little bit, adding a bit more sci-fi to it, but not too much else, if I'm going to be honest. This game, on the other hand, was a bit more a fusing of different cultures that I thought actually was a pretty cool concept. So that's ultimately why I ended up choosing this. And well, Chrono Trigger obviously being a pretty highly revered game in general, I think it only makes sense for us to at least give it a second like win, especially since this game does look pretty good, especially for a Super Nintendo game. But then that leads us to the last category of tonight, the titular game of the year. So you guys can probably tell this was a year that, yes, there were a decent amount of games released, but ultimately not really a lot of game of the year material, at least in my opinion. And if I'm going to be honest, even some of the ones I chose for game of the year, you can definitely make a good case that it's probably not the best choice. I don't know, 95 is just this was just a very hard year for me to try to figure out and nail down what is like a good enough game to represent the year. Because 95 was just not really a memorable year for gaming. Outside of RPGs and like platformers. So I will admit this is a very tentative game of the year nomination list. So just keep that in mind. This is what I ended up choosing. So I chose Alone in the Dark 3 mostly for its continued general narrative and gameplay that the previous Alone in the Dark games had that was still competent with this game. I also chose Star Wars Dark Forces for being a generally pretty solid first-person shooter and just being a really good Star Wars game in general. Chrono Trigger for being a fantastic RPG that I highly recommend you guys check out. Rayman for its excellent platforming, level design, and just general art direction. And Command and Conquer for pretty much streamlining and shaping RTS games to how they are to this day. Again, not a lot of choices, but I gotta be real. This was just kind of a tough year to try to figure out. But ultimately, I think these are the ones that probably make the most sense. At least in my mind. Of course, if I end up doing the redo stream, I'll probably change this up a little bit, but I don't know. 95 was just a fucking not a good year for gaming. It's not the worst year, but it just was not it. But let's go over the winner. So here we go. So the award for Game of the Year of 1995 goes to Command and Conquer. Command and Conquer wins. I was close to choosing Chrono Trigger, but I felt like Command and Conquer was the one that made the most sense in my mind. Because of just how much this game really did innovate as far as strategy games, and specifically the RTS genre. This game has excellent gameplay. I mean, I love RTS games, so of course I'm going to be biased on that. But this was kind of the first game that I felt like was a playable enough RTS that anyone can really enjoy. I mean, there's a reason why they remastered this multiple times and ported this plenty of times to different consoles. And even just kind of putting that aside, this game had a pretty unique premise for whenever it came out. It wasn't the most contemporary military game at the time. I mean, I'm just going to be real here. It's more of a science fiction game than it is a modern military game. It just has a lot of modern military themes with it. But the idea of having an alien resource just come out, land on Earth, and everyone trying to gather as much of it as possible for their own personal gain, and that's sparking a massive war, basically World War III. Well, maybe World War III. Depends on if the Red Alert series is in the same timeline or not, but, you know, that I'm not neither here or there about that conversation. But as far as creating a massive conflict, specifically in Europe and Africa in this game's case, it's a pretty unique premise. And like I said, a lot of that is definitely carried by the people who are in the FOV cutscenes, which adds a lot of a more grounded experience. I mean, yeah, you can definitely tell it's not the most budget-based game out there, but you can definitely tell that they spent a lot of time developing the world of this. And I think that's something that's worth noting, especially considering that both of the campaigns are actually pretty engaging in their own respect. And of course, I already mentioned music and sound design, excellent in this game. Really does, pump up the tension a bit. And this game helped standardize the RTS genre. It was the game that sort of set, this was, yes, Warcraft may have been the game to walk, but this game ran so that every other game could run. The mechanics and the streamlined gameplay in this game was really what made the RTS genre stand out for the next 15 years to come. And that's ultimately why I think Command & Conquer is the game that deserves the Game of the Year for 1995. I highly recommend that anyone check out Command & Conquer. So, that's all I gotta really say. Let's recap, shall we? So, for the best action adventure, I gave it to Clock Tower. Best platformer, I gave it to Rayman. Best RPG, I gave it to Chrono Trigger. Best shooter game, I gave it to Star Wars Dark Forces. Best sim strategy, I gave it to Command & Conquer. Best sports racing fighting, I gave to Wipeout. Best art direction, I gave to Chrono Trigger. And then the Game of the Year, I gave to Command & Conquer. As far as my personal top 10 favorites, again, this one's also pretty tentative. But as of this moment, my personal top 10 favorite games from 1995 include Star Wars Dark Forces, Rayman, XCOM Terror from the Deep, Command & Conquer, Hexen Beyond Heretic, Chrono Trigger, Secret of Evermore, Clock Tower, Wipeout, and Air Combat / Ace Combat. So, of course. And, well, this is where we get into the honorable mentions. Although, to be fair, this is probably more of a guilty pleasures thing. These are games that I mostly just kind of respect, as opposed to games that I think are genuinely really, really good. Though there are some that are pretty good in here that I recommend you guys seek out for yourselves. So we got the first Descent game, which I didn't know if I wanted to count this as a shooter game or if I wanted to count this as a simulation game. So that's why I didn't nominate it. I was this close to doing it too, but it just was kind of off for me. Mega Man 7 also came out this year on Super Nintendo. But I mean, X3 is probably going to be the better game regardless. Metal Warriors for being another sort of action platformer sort of game, though definitely not as refined as Rayman, in my opinion. Just kind of trapped on the Super Nintendo hardware that it was. Castlevania Dracula X. I think I like this game more than most people. because I guess this is a remake of Rondo of Blood, which was originally released on PCs at the time. This was just sort of the console port-ish remake hybrid thing. I don't even know what to call it that came out. So, yeah. Kingsfield 2, just kind of for its foreboding atmosphere and all that fun stuff, though not as refined as its sequel. Lemmings 3D, for being just kind of a decent little puzzle game with little cute creatures walking around, which is nice. Mech Warrior 2, just for being a pretty decent mech game, somewhat related to the BattleTech series. So, Tetris Attack, because I like Tetris. It's another guilty pleasure of mine. So, yeah. Space Hulk, Vengeance of the Blood Angels, the sequel to the 1993 game. Yes, this is actually an early 40k game, by the way. Yeah, even as early as the 90s, they had 40k games like this, and mid-90s. Though, it's weird, because this one is kind of a strategy shooter hybrid game, but you gotta really like the game. I kind of like the game, but I know it's not for everyone, so do keep that in mind. Same thing with this next game, Police Quest SWAT, which is part of the SWAT sub-series of Police Quest games. I think I like this game more so because of what the later games in this sub-series would spawn into, but as far as being like an edutainment game based off of how to showcase what police force work is, it's actually kind of decent. And then, of course, we got Battle Arena Toshinden 2. Excuse me, I don't know how to pronounce that. The sequel to Battle Arena Toshinden that came out very late that year. Because, yeah. And then we got 11th Hour, which, funny enough, is actually a sequel to a game called The Seventh Guest. It's another sort of puzzle point-and-click game. Just not as good, but I just kind of like the creepy atmosphere, so it's a guilty pleasure of mine. Suikoden, the original game, is also being nominated, is also a honorable mention here. So, again, fortunately had to be snubbed, but quality JRPG regardless. And then last but not least, an expansion pack I'm going to give an honorable mention to. The Master Levels for Doom 2. I played through this a couple of years ago, and I thought it was actually pretty cool. So if you wanted more Doom 2 action, this is not too bad of an option. But yeah, that, my friends, was the Caspian Game Awards for 1995. Stay tuned for 1994, because I have a bit more high hopes for 1994. At least doing, like, from what I remember and from what I've looked at so far. And so I hope you guys are pretty excited about that. And of course, if you guys can, and you guys want to check out more of my content, of course, if you're watching this on Twitch, hit the follow button down below and turn the bell icon down below. If you're watching this on YouTube, hit the subscribe and the bell icon over there as well. While you guys are at it, make sure to check out the links down below as well, specifically the Discord, the SoundCloud, and the Linktree. If you want to directly support me, you can also hit the subscribe button over on Twitch. If you can't necessarily do that, that's completely fine. I'm just glad the guys took time to watch this. But regardless of all that, though, make sure to share the stream to other people as well, and continue to be awesome people in the process. But until then, I'll see you guys in the next one. Hopefully, I'll be able to be a lot less stuffy, although, to be fair, I'm already doing pretty good right now. But yeah, I'll see you guys in the next one. Have a good night, and peace out. Bye!